This video focuses on peer pressure, considered not so much as a psychological or sociological phenomenon, but understood in the context of argumentation, so as an informal fallacy. And what we're going to do in this video is 8 things. We're going to talk about what peer pressure is. We'll look at the argument structure so you can wrap your head around what's going on in it. We'll talk about why it's a bad form of argumentation or inference or reasoning. We'll look at several common situations in which it's likely to occur. Then we'll zero in on 3 examples of the fallacy so you can see some concrete cases that might help you be able to identify what's going on with it. We'll talk about some of the ways you can spot somebody committing this fallacy or what you should be on the lookout for. Then for you students who have to be able to distinguish fallacies apart from each other, we're going to talk about what other fallacies it's not but kind of looks like. And then finally we'll conclude by talking about how you can avoid falling into this fallacy in your own communication, your own reasoning, your own life. So let's start with talking about what the fallacy actually is. Now, it's sometimes called the bandwagon fallacy or also group loyalty. There's different ways to refer to this. But what's going on at its most basic in an appeal to peer pressure is some sort of appeal to emotion, specifically to the audience's desire to belong to a particular group or their fear of being in some way ostracized from that group or not belonging to that group. So you're playing off of a person's emotion, and it's also framed in a way that makes it look a bit like an appeal to popularity because it has to do with a group. Now, typically the person who's making the appeal to peer pressure is actually going to belong to or is assumed to, sometimes incorrectly, assumed to belong to that group. If we go on and we look at the structure of this fallacy, it's actually pretty simple and pretty straightforward. But notice what the implicit premises, those are the ones in brackets, turn out to be. So it begins with something very explicit, saying that Group A, whoever Group A happens to be, thinks that claim X is true. Now, how do you get from there to the conclusion that X is in fact true? There's a couple things that have to happen along the way. There's 2 implicit premises, one of which is that you, the audience, desire to belong to Group A. You care about that one way or the other. If you don't care about group membership, this thing is not going to get off of the ground. But assuming that you actually do, that's an implicit premise. The other implicit premise would be that belonging to Group A requires that you accept claims that they think are true. That actually could be, in fact, a true premise, because some groups are very picky about, the things that the people belonging to those groups believe. In any case, that's the general structure of the fallacy. And when we lay it out like that, you can see that this is not a very good way of arriving at the truth or of doing argument. If we look at it in graphic terms, here you can see that we've got a group and people belong to it. You've got a member Q and a member R, and member Q is making some sort of appeal saying A is true. Most of the people in the group believe that A is true, and so member R has a desire to belong to that group, and they're playing off of that desire to make sure that they are willing to accept that claim. Now, why is this a fallacy? What's going wrong with this? So there's a couple different things that we want to point out. One is that, and this should go without saying, but it doesn't go without saying, whether a claim is accepted by a particular group is usually not relevant to the truth of the claim. Now, are there some contexts in which some groups actually, might matter more, where, the consensus of a particular group is taken as somehow having something to do with believing that something is true, having good grounds for that? Sure. We call those groups, we tend to call those groups experts, right? In most cases, we're not talking about groups like that when we're talking about peer pressure, though. Now, another problem is that a desire to belong to a group is not generally a good reason to accept a claim as true. There's no intrinsic connection between your desire to belong to this particular group or club or clique or whatever it happens to be and a claim being true. So how do you get from point A to point B? Well, we saw, through erroneous reasoning. And then another thing to keep in mind, many groups, not only in the past, but in the present as well, some of them with very intelligent individuals in many other respects, do accept claims that are dubious or false as being true, or vice versa. They accept false claims, or they accept true claims as being false or dubious. And the mechanism involved is what we want to be particularly wary about. Now, what are some common situations in which you're likely to encounter peer pressure affecting people's reasoning? So, like I put here, it can rise with practically any group that a person desires to belong to or desires not to be excluded from. It can even happen with groups that have noble aims, that have wonderful consequences, that, enroll beautiful, intelligent, noble people. Any group can become a grounds for peer pressure for some of its members. So this is something we always want to be attentive to. What are the contexts in which we have to particularly worry about this? Well, groups of friends or peer groups. That's why it's called peer pressure, right? Families. Families provide a context in which this can occur, and there's very understandable reasons why that would be the case. Offices and workplaces. I'll give you just an example, one example that I didn't put in here, but one that's commonplace. Somebody goes around with a jar and says, we're chipping in for this charity, or we're chipping in for this memorial, or something like that. And, are you going to contribute? Sometimes they do it by bringing around envelopes or things like that. Now, you can say there's a claim being made there that you ought to contribute to that. And a lot of people feel a kind of peer pressure. They don't want to look bad. They want to be involved in that group. They want to be a member. And so they contribute. That has nothing to do with whether we should contribute to charity. It's just not a good reason, peer pressure, for us to actually do so. Educational institutions. I'm not just talking about kids who, bully each other or police each other or come up with crazy fads or stuff like that. I'm also talking about the instructors and the administrators. You see a lot of them engaging in something like peer pressure in their own reasoning. Educational unions are a great example of this. And the people who are anti-union sometimes fit into those kinds of groups as well. If the appeal is being made on the basis of, well, look, this is what we all think, and you want to be part of our group, what we've got there is peer pressure. Politics. This is done all the time in politics, right? It's a common technique. In part, that's what holds political parties and coalitions together. Religion. Not to say that religion is always involving this, but there's quite a lot of context within religious institutions and communities in which peer pressure can come to play. And the most interesting in part because usually these people aren't part of the group, is advertising. Advertising and marketing. It's possible to try to appeal to somebody to do something or believe something or to purchase something on the basis of then they'll be in the in-group, then they'll be part of this group, or they won't be ostracized. And very often that group is totally imaginary. Let's look at some examples now. So, example one. I call this one pop artistry, and I put musicianship in quotes because I tend to think that most pop music is not displaying a high level of musicianship. I'm sure that somebody will, find that very controversial, but most people involved in music don't think so. So I made up this band's name. There may, in fact, be a band named this out there. What do you mean you don't like Goo Ga Goo? They're the best. All the cool kids listen to them. You have to start getting up on your pop bands if you want to fit in. And drop that classic metal stuff. I know your dad likes it and you like hanging out with him and listening to it, but come on. And so what's the conclusion? You should like the pop band Goo Ga Goo. Now, pop music is a particularly interesting case here because it stands for popular, right? And so pop music is just whatever a whole bunch of people happen to be purchasing. Now, it also tends to be lowest common denominator stuff, musically speaking. That's why it's able to sell so well. It's sort of like the musical equivalent of cotton candy or junk food. in many cases. You know, it recycles the same basic riffs and lines and hooks over and over and over again. That's why they end up suing each other every once in a while, right? Now, we could debate the merits of classic metal versus pop music versus hip hop, whatever hip hop actually is these days, because it doesn't seem to have any internal consistency, versus R&B versus whatever, right? If the basis for saying that you should be listening to this is that that's what all of us are doing, what we've got here is an appeal to peer pressure. Could be that one should actually listen to pop music. People have made that argument to me that I ought to be up on that sort of thing if I want to be qualified to speak about it. But if the main thing is to say if you don't do it, you don't fit in with us, then we've got peer pressure. Let's look at another example. Now this one is, I'm doing a reverse of what always was used as peer pressure examples back when I was a kid. We had all these PSAs and after school specials, and there'd always be like a circle of kids, the cool kids, the burnouts. And there'd be little Jimmy or little Sally, and she'd come along or he'd come along, and you know, somebody'd be puffing on a joint and they'd say, "Hey, you want to take a hit?" And then Jimmy would say, "No, that's not really for me." And they'd say something like, "Come on, don't you want to be cool? Don't you want to fit in with us?" It was supposed to show us that, you know, you're not supposed to do drugs, even if the cool kids are doing them, because that's not a good reason to do drugs, if there is any good reason to do drugs. Now, we could also, you know, have a kind of, let's call it straight line pressure, right? Don't do drugs because that makes you a dork, you know? What are you doing smoking pot? That's what the dorky kids do. Now the in thing is not to do drugs. Didn't you get the message? And so the message is you shouldn't do marijuana. There's probably a lot of good reasons not to smoke pot. I could think of, you know, quite a few of them, but we're not going to go into all of that right now. The fact that the cool kids are no longer smoking pot is not a reason not to smoke pot. There are some good independent reasons on their own that have nothing to do with, you know, the group that you want to belong to and what they do. If it happens to keep you from doing something that's not good for you, I mean, just consider the effects on your lungs, right? It's not good for you to smoke that sort of stuff. It's got good consequences, right? But it's a bad reasoning process, so we've got a fallacy here. Let's look at the third one. This one's a little bit more serious. The thin blue line. This is one that appeals to, say, police officers, correctional officers, people who are in positions of authority and involved with policing in some way. You have to understand, imagine, you know, one police officer saying this to another. There's times when you have to back up your fellow police officers, even if you think that it's legally or morally the wrong thing. Loyalty matters the most, and you'd want the thin blue line to stand behind you if you ever need it. So what's the conclusion there? You should lie in cases where you're being asked about witnessing police engaging in criminal activity and not report it. This is something that does go on. This is, you know, well documented. Now, this is a big problem. There's an appeal to peer pressure here. There may be another fallacy as well, which is an appeal to fear, you know, the threat of force, that you're going to be left in the lurch when something is dangerous. But what's really here is an appeal to peer pressure. You're not going to be part of the group if you don't show your loyalty to the group by not snitching. And this can happen with criminal organizations too. This can happen with corrections. This can happen in all sorts of cases. This could happen with the TSA. Pretty sure it probably does. In any case, what we've got here is an example of peer pressure. Now, let's talk about how you might spot this fallacy. What should you be on guard for? What are the red flags? One thing is you want to pay attention to cases in which, instead of providing good grounds for a claim, reference is being made to the group that accepts the claim. And reference is being made as the group that you want to belong to, or the group that you do belong to. Now, that's a sign that peer pressure may be what's going on there. If they're not providing good grounds, if they're not providing any alternate grounds, and they're just saying, hey, this is what we believe in this group, you probably have peer pressure. Also, be on guard with certain groups. Some groups demand a high degree of what they call loyalty from their members, and it may in fact be something that we would call loyalty, because it meets certain criteria for that. There's philosophers who've thought quite a bit about the nature of loyalty. Josiah Royce actually wrote a whole book about it. What a lot of people call loyalty isn't the real thing, though. It's something more like giving in to peer pressure and being willing to exert peer pressure on other people within the group. So there are some groups that you can look at and you can say, that's something that goes on quite a bit. If that's the case, that's sort of a breeding ground for appeals to peer pressure. Also, you want to be attentive to explicit or more often implicit threats to a person's group membership that are being relied upon as part of an argument. Now, why? Because that's the way peer pressure works. That's an integral part of it. You play off the person's desire. The flip side of desire is fear. They want to belong to the group. They don't want that taken away from them. So when you see something like that being referenced, it may not necessarily be an instance of peer pressure, but you should start looking. For those of you who are students who are, say, taking a critical thinking class and need to be able to tell these fallacies apart, one thing we want to point out is this is very similar to the appeal to popularity. Remember, the appeal to popularity says a lot of people believe X, therefore X is probably true or is definitely true. What this does is it adds in a particular focus on membership in that particular group. So it's similar, but it's also different by its distinctive focus. Another one that is very close to this is appeal to fear. That's an emotional appeal. In cases where there's an implied or explicit threat as part of the argument, but it doesn't actually have to do with group membership, you've got a clear appeal to fear, right? If I just go up to you and I say, protection service, be a real shame if something happened to your shop here and I start, knocking stuff over. We've all seen this in the movies, right? That's not necessarily an appeal to group membership. As a matter of fact, you probably don't want to belong to my group. You'd rather my group get the hell out of there and never deal with you again, but it is an appeal to fear. So again, the key deciding factor for this is whether one is playing off of the desire or fear having to do with group membership. Now, not every argument that makes reference to group membership is necessarily going to be a fallacious argument. So you don't want to jump to conclusions and say that just because there's some sort of reference to the group or some sort of reference even to peers, that peer pressure is going on. You want to look carefully at that. The last thing that we need to talk about as far as content goes is how you can avoid falling into this fallacy yourself. So if you want to be a good critical thinker, what do you need to be doing? Well, one thing is you want to pay attention to your own group memberships. How strongly you desire belonging to that group. Is that something that can be used against you? Is that something that gives people a hook? And what you're willing to compromise in order to have that membership. If you know that there's a group that you have a very strong desire to belong to and you would sacrifice just about anything to belong to that group, you may be susceptible to peer pressure more than somebody else. So you want to be attuned to that. And then, of course, when you're discussing matters within a group, try to resist temptations as best as you can to appeal to another person's desire to be part of the group and see if the claims that you want to make can be made with reference to better grounds, things that are a person could agree to whether they belong to that group or not. Why do you want to do that? Well, you don't want to get in the habit yourself of relying on peer pressure as a kind of crutch because that's not good for you. But you also don't want to do that to the other person because if they buy into it, that's making them a less critical thinker as well. So, you've got yourself and the other to think about. The last thing I'm going to say is that this video is part of a series discussing common fallacies in reasoning and argument, and it belongs to a new channel devoted specifically to critical thinking, logic, and argumentation. So if you're finding this useful, if you enjoy this video, share it with other people and check out the other videos and ultimately the other series that I'll be offering on this channel.